All right, good afternoon, class. This is Mr. Harris sharing with you guys today a little lecture about interest groups in our electoral process. I want to first state that I recorded this on March 4th. So the events that happened this weekend, I mean, oof, crazy, right? Okay, let's get going. All right, so we should have by now talked about how a bill becomes a law. You guys do have that assignment that is going to be due this week about this subject. And we've gone over the series of steps that must take place. A representative or senator must introduce a bill. It goes to committee hearings. If the committee approves of it, it goes down to the floor where everyone in either the House or the Senate votes on it. If it's passed through one, it goes to the other, and the process plays out again, committee, then floor, okay? If it passes both of them, then it goes to the governor or president, since we're focusing on the federal government here, and they have a choice of whether to sign the bill or not, okay? So I'm sharing this information as well in the slideshow, so if you guys are looking at it later to help you finish this assignment. Idea, introduction, committee, debate, vote, presidential action, and then of course the president can veto. That means he says no, and the veto can then be overridden by a 2/3 majority of either the House, of both the House and Senate. That is very rare. It's only happened one time in my recent memory, and that was a bill that would have allowed victims of the 9/11 terrorist attack to sue the Saudi Arabian government. President Obama said, hey, this is a really bad idea. If we pass this law, then victims of American aggression can sue us. Congress didn't listen. They overrode his veto. And then later on, they blamed him for not telling them what a bad idea it was. But that is a side topic. Okay, so you need, in order to actually get a bill through the Congress, you need a majority of at least 218 in the House and at least 51 people in the Senate, or 50 plus 1 with the VP. Then it eventually gets sent to the other body. Okay, so we've gone over that. However, real life politics is more complicated than this. So how does a bill really become a law? What convinces our politicians to support a bill or policy? Okay, and in this country, there has been a number of studies based upon what does the public want versus what does Congress actually do. And it turns out that no matter how popular an idea is, even if 90% of Americans support something, that doesn't really affect the chances of this piece of legislation being passed. No matter what public approval is, it's somewhere between 0.3 and 0.2%. However, if more of the elite, the wealthy in this country, like a policy, it is much more likely to get passed. And so our government doesn't necessarily reflect the equal interest of all of its citizens. Certain groups are able to make their voices heard more than others. Okay. And I'll give you just a little example from one of the last really big pieces of legislation that got passed. And this was President Trump's biggest legislative achievement. Okay, this is the only major law that came through, and this was his tax cuts. And if we look at who got the biggest percentages of the tax cuts, oh, surprise, surprise, it's the people at the top. You'll also notice that the tax cuts for the lower and middle class go down over time, while the tax cuts for the wealthy do not nearly as much. Okay. So we're going to use this term today, interest groups. You'll often hear special interest groups, but everyone's interest group is special to them. So what it is an organization of people with similar policy goals who enter the political process to try and achieve those goals or aims, but don't run their own candidates for office. So we'll use this example a lot in class today. The NRA, the National Rifle Association. Its members are people who support gun rights. And there is no NRA party. Okay, I'm not the representative who runs for the NRA party. However, they do support different laws and support different candidates. So what do? They want to influence public policy. And there's a couple of ways that interest groups go about achieving this goal. Lobbying, which we'll talk a lot about today, electioneering, litigation, and going public. And electioneering, of course, has to do with elections. Litigation means through the legal system like lawsuits. And then going public are these public ad campaigns that can also be very effective. Now, a lot of people are critical of interest groups. But again, whatever your policy is, there's probably a group that supports that. In general, though, they do seem to have an outside influence on our government. An example of a lot of times of what they try to do is special interests will lobby lawmakers. We'll discuss that more in a second. They'll pretty much cozy up with, give money to a congressperson. That congressperson will then help write a law that benefits them. The government creates a mandate. Okay, let's use, for example, a new law they could put in. Everyone must purchase cell phone insurance. Like maybe you don't think you need cell phone insurance, but there's definitely an insurance company that would benefit if everyone had to buy it. The citizens then have to follow whatever the government laws are, and the special interest group usually receives the benefits. I'll give you an example. In Texas, the agricultural industry is super powerful, and especially the meat industry. So they lobbied the local legislator to pass laws that made it illegal to film the inside of slaughterhouses. Now, if citizens do that, they'll get arrested. And as a result, whatever stuff is going on inside the slaughterhouse is not revealed to the public. And there are examples of this on the left and on the right, depending on who is in power. So what is lobbying? Lobbying is the process of persuading public officials to take actions favorable to a given organized group. Lobbyists are usually paid employees or hired hands for an interest group. So for example, our National Rifle Association, they have a head office, and that office employs lawyers and lobbyists. And it's these lobbyists' job to try to influence the politicians. How do you get a job as a lobbyist? Well, they're looking for people who have access to public officials so they can present the concerns, agendas, and needs of the interest group. So let's say the NRA wants to support or wants a certain law passed. They could find a local congressman and say, hey, we want you to be on board with our law. We'll throw you a fundraiser. They throw a big fancy dinner. The local congressman is able to raise a bunch of money for his campaign. While he's there, of course, he's listening to the NRA, and then he votes on bills that might affect him. Now, just because they give him money doesn't mean he has to listen to them. Okay, so keep that in mind. So what lobbyists do is, number one, they want access to the politicians. I've mentioned in class my desire to meet Rodney Davis and how many times I've emailed him. Never once have I gotten an official response back from him. But if I worked for a lobbying agency, I might be able to have some more access to him. And lobbyists try to build up rapport or friendships with public officials, get phone numbers, email addresses, maybe they're Facebook friends, so they can call on them to try to help them out in certain situations. Okay. And oftentimes, let's say the NRA knows that Joe Biden is going to be president. So maybe they'll try to find a college friend of Joe Biden who will then go and talk to Joe Biden and say, hey, I represent the NRA, but you should listen to me because I'm one of your friends. So they do a lot of hiring the friends or employees of former politicians, of current politicians, and they also hire former politicians to help them out. In Washington, D.C., most of the major lobbying firms are on K Street. So often we hear it referred to as K Street. And there are some of those lobbyists up there at the top. So the biggest group of really influential lobbyists are former politicians. And we'll give an example here in a second. If you worked for a politician on Washington, you also have a decent shot of getting a job doing this. People who have been in charge of different government agencies in the past. So if you want to start a new venture, like let's say, this is a real life example actually. My favorite sport is mixed martial arts. And for a long time, mixed martial arts was banned in most of the United States. When the UFC was coming up, they hired a bunch of former state athletic directors to work for them and teach them how to convince the athletic directors to get their sport accepted. In general, they're looking for people with juice, connections to the system. And just in the last 15 years, 200 former members of Congress have become lobbyists. And here's our example we're going to use today for a former politician turned lobbyist. This is former Speaker of the House, John Boehner. He was Speaker from, I believe, 2011 through 2017. Okay, so while Obama was president, he was the Republican Speaker of the House. And while he was in the Congress, he voted just one time on an issue related to marijuana. However, he said, nope, marijuana is wrong. We do not want this in our country. That's what he said when he was an elected official who was Speaker of the House. Well, after Mr. Boehner retired, he was hired by one of the largest marijuana corporations in the United States. So they took a guy who was opposed to it. Now he works for this firm. And he definitely calls up all his former political buddies in Washington and says, hey, how can we get you on board with supporting marijuana, even though when he was a politician, he was against it? And there are many, many examples of situations like this where former Congress people go to work for these interest groups after they're done in Washington. Now, a lot of people have a negative view on interest groups, and it is illegal to give a politician directly bribes or money. However, there's a lot of gray areas in what a lobbyist can do on behalf of a special interest group. Tomorrow, I'm going to have you guys look at a couple of videos about some different lobbyists as well as other interest groups, and you'll get to meet Mr. Jack Abramoff, who was a superstar lobbyist in the 90s, okay? And Mr. Abramoff worked on lots of different cases. One of his biggest clients was the Native American casinos. So these Native American tribes that want to open casinos or stop the states they're in from opening casinos would hire Mr. Abramoff to get them more influence in Washington, D.C. He later on was caught and went to jail for a bunch of illegal stuff he was doing, but he wrote a book about how to be a successful lobbyist. And here are some of the rules he said. Figure out who's running the bill and get close to them. Who drafted the piece of legislation that is going to affect your interest group? Let's try to get on the phone or in person with this guy or woman to influence them. Go to them and explain why they definitely should pass this bill that favors your group, okay? Tell them, don't worry about it. Even if this blows up, it's not going to come back to you. And then or another thing you could do is you could sneak in small rule changes into legislation that's going to be signed anyways. And he'll give you a lot of examples of how he does this in the video you guys will watch tomorrow. Now, I have a little bit of experience with some different interest groups and with a place where Mr. Abramoff was very powerful. The guy we just looked at is the same guy over here when he was a little bit younger, okay? And as I think I've mentioned in this class a couple of times, I used to live on a small island called Saipan. And Saipan is a US territory. So it belongs to America. The language is English and stuff like that. But we do not have a voting representative in Congress. The island is also much closer to Asia than it is to the mainland. And so it is a different feel from most of the United States. Well, back in the 90s, there wasn't a lot of money coming into Saipan. So they opened up some textile firms, okay? And they made clothing for companies like Levi, Gap, there was a bunch of other ones. And these textile factories were located on Saipan, and they were worked almost exclusively by Chinese immigrants. Okay, so people that were not US citizens. And these immigrants would get paid 25, 50 cents an hour to work in these factories making this clothing. Because Saipan is part of America, they got to put made in the USA on back of their clothing, despite not following federal regulations for minimum wage and workers' rights and a bunch of other things, okay? But they were able to pull this scheme off for years and years because those Saipan businessmen paid Mr. Abramoff to make sure their operations stayed legal in Washington, D.C. So he would always make sure that the Saipan interests were defended. Well, he got caught and they actually did away with this system. All of the factories on island closed down, and a lot of these Chinese immigrants were forced to go back to China afterwards. But this island is a very strange place. And one of the cool things about living there is it's really small. There's only 50,000 people. And as a result, it's kind of like a mini state. It's got a governor, it has a house, it has a senate, it's got its own multiple newspapers. It had all sorts of the same institutions of a state would. But because it was so small, I got to meet a lot of these people. And I got to see up close and personal how politics worked at a local level. Now, recently, my island needed another way to make some money. So they decided to open a casino on island. And this is actually a small island off the coast where I got engaged to my wife. But they ended up letting a Chinese company come in and open a casino on island against the votes of the local people. And that casino is called Best Sunshine, and it's an enormous venture. And on the board of this casino is a bunch of former congressmen. There's a former FBI director. There's a couple of former governors who were added to the board to make sure that in Washington, they would let it operate legally. Well, things didn't turn out very well so far, as the Department of Justice is currently investigating massive amounts of money laundering, but they had the lobbyists, so they're able to operate at least for a little while. Okay, now, sorry for that tangent. Let's get back to lobbying. If we look at what different areas of the economy spend on lobbying, we can see the biggest lobbying group, this is in 2018, was the pharmaceutical industry or the health industry. And they spent about $280+ million on lobbying different congresspeople. Up next is insurance, electronics, different business associations, oil and gas. Okay, they're a very powerful lobby. Utilities, real estate, hospitals, nursing homes, security and investments, on down the list. You can see, there's my people. Education definitely has a lobbyist. Our unions definitely lobby politicians at the local, state, and federal level. Now, you might notice, though, there's not a lot of lobbying groups on here that represent the middle class or the lower class. One group that is extending rapidly the amount of money they spend is the tech industry. as that becomes like the biggest industry around the world. So you can see these firms are ramping up how much money they spend to try to influence politicians. By the way, Alphabet is Google. It's the parent company of Google. And a lot of people assume that these tech companies are definitely just supporting the left because they're usually based in California. And the people that work at these tech companies definitely give way more money to the Democrats. But if you look at who the companies give money to, it's pretty close, okay? Why would they give money to both sides? Well, they want to make sure their interests are protected no matter if Republicans or Democrats are in charge. And often, so you see like the pharmaceutical companies giving giant amounts to both. And it's interesting sometimes companies will flip-flop who they're giving the most money to depending on what their interests are at the time. And so in 2010, the Republicans controlled Congress and they kept controlling Congress. I think they assumed the Democrats were going to win, but they did not. And they went right back to giving more money to the Republicans afterwards. So that's one way. And we'll see some examples of lobbying tomorrow. There's also electioneering, which has to do with directing money towards political candidates. It costs a lot of money to run for office and especially to run for president in this country. So you can form different ways of giving money to the campaigns they can spend on advertising and other needs. You can also give endorsements to candidates. You'll often hear like, this candidate is endorsed by the NRA, or if they're a Democrat, they're endorsed by the ACLU. They can also try to recruit members to help volunteer during the campaign season and provide political information, which of course might be biased during campaigns. Now, super PACs are political action committees, and they have begun playing a very outsized role in our politics as of late. And here's an example of what a super PAC kind of does. President Trump, when he was running for re-election, of course, made his own advertisements. He did his own campaigning and stuff like that. And people could give money to his campaign and he could spend that. But there's a limit how much money you can give to an individual candidate. It's around $5,000. So let's say I've already spent my $5,000 to help re-elect President Trump. What else can I do if I'm a rich guy? Well, I can form a super PAC, like the Committee to Defend the President, and I can give that super PAC as much money as possible. This super PAC can then run ads for the president, okay? And you'll often see in the end of political commercials, and we'll show a couple examples tomorrow, my name is Donald Trump and I approve this message. That means it's coming from them. When you don't hear that at the end, that means a different group is paying for these advertisings. Right? They also can sue. So you can file lawsuits against the federal, the state government, or against private corporations in court. One example of this was Citizens United. This was a private corporation that made an anti-Hillary Clinton movie. And they wanted to show that movie like the week of the election. And at first, the Elections Commission said, no, that's illegal. You can't do that. So Citizens United sued, and the Supreme Court decided that corporations, what they decided was political spending is a form of protected speech under the First Amendment. If I hate, let's say, what's something I hate? I hate billboards, okay? I really do. I could spend as much money as I want to on advertisements on TV saying, let's ban billboards. Let's say I hate Governor Pritzker. I can only give $5,000 to his opponent, but I can start an ad campaign, fire Pritzker, and I can play those ads all the time thanks to this decision from Citizens United. On the left, they want to get rid of this decision. However, as the Supreme Court right now is 6-3 conservative, that is very unlikely to happen. Okay. Yeah. So the government may not stop corporations or unions from spending money to support or denounce individual candidates in elections. And in general, usually unions support the left as they try to pass bills that protect unions, when most conservative states are anti-union. Another thing you can do is you can, as a special interest group or interest group, you can go public and try to put pressure on Washington to do something. And so there's lots of examples of public relations campaigns, and some that you guys may have seen. These were all over the place when I was in high school and elementary school. It's things like the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, these kind of advertisements. This is an interest group. Okay, they don't like this thing. They don't like drug usage. So they're going to put out advertisements to try to convince the public not to do it. It's not as popular anymore, but there's a group called MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, that really helped shift the narrative in this country of how dangerous it was to drink and drive. So these public action groups can have a lot of influence. I do want to point out that the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, its biggest backers are usually the tobacco and alcohol companies. Okay. So what makes interest groups powerful? Well, their size. How many members do they have? How much money do they got? And these large groups can really dominate media and donations. Okay. And the NRA, which again is the National Rifle Association, has pretty much made it almost impossible to pass any further gun regulation. We also have the AARP, or the American Association of Retired Persons. And our government definitely does a lot more for the elderly than they do for the young. Okay. They can also bring more intensity to an issue and throw money at it. Money, money, money. Okay. Usually, money goes to the incumbents, the people who are already in office. All right. So here are some other examples of some interest groups. And retired people, these are both labor unions, American Federation of Labor, and I forget what the other one is, but they're both labor unions, big time. Sierra Club's environmentalists. Exxon, of course, is an oil industry. Blue Cross Blue Shield, insurance industries. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now I think is a liberal organization as well. Different leadership packs for the Republicans and the Democrats. And American Civil Liberties, the Right to Life, those anti-abortion groups. There is tons of them across our country. Okay. So our NRA, they can give money to political action campaigns. They can hire lawyers, PR firms, and the NRA actually had their own network for a while to make information to the public. Okay. All right. Let me go back for 1 second. Sorry, guys. There's a lot of talk about the iron triangle in our government, and it's Congress, interest groups, and then the bureaucracy, what the government's made up of. And these things tend to fund and feed each other and keep things relatively the same. So obviously there are changes in our country. They're usually slower at a federal level. And this is part of the thing that keeps it kind of slower, which you can see as a good thing or a bad thing. So these interest groups, they'll give electoral support to members of Congress. Congress will then give funding. They'll pass laws that give more money and political support. Okay. In return, these interest groups will get low regulations, special favors, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm just going to talk about a couple of really powerful, almost individual interest groups. On the right, we've got Sheldon Adelson, and he is a casino magnate. Okay. So very, very wealthy. He's very old and he's very conservative. And he, in 2020 election cycle, spent $183 million supporting different candidates across the country. We got the Koch brother, okay, Charles died, but they are from a fossil fuel family, Koch Industries. And these guys have pumped millions, if not billions of dollars throughout the last 20 years, going against the science of climate change. And together, they're extremely wealthy, okay? $90 billion between the two of them, although his has now been divided among his family. And they're very conservative. Okay? And they said in the 2016 election that they spent $890 million trying to get their voices heard. Okay? And I will point out, they have publicly said many times they are against teachers' unions, and they're often sometimes the big backers for charter schools. On the left, the guy who's brought up the most is George Soros, and he is an immigrant to the United States, and he made money from Wall Street as well as from currency, so betting against different currencies, and he is super rich, and he is elderly, and he says he donates around $100 million a year to different progressive causes. Okay, guys, tomorrow, let me just go back for a second. You guys will look at some videos, okay, about different lobbying groups and strategies, and then answer some questions about them. Also coming up, we're going to have that quiz. So make sure you guys have all your notes and stuff done. And I will talk to you guys sometime soon.